One of the contributions of anthropology and social sciences more broadly to thinking about culture and mental health has been the way that it has interrogated the idea of what Marcel Mauss called the cultural concept of the person. A number of cultural critics have pointed out that mental health practices, psychology, psychoanalysis, and so on, and particularly as they've unfolded in the history of the US, are heavily underwritten by a particularly individualistic or egocentric concept of the person that understands people as bounded by the skin, as having their individual agency, a kind of monological, monovocal self that is oriented toward achieving mastery of the world, exercising freedom of choice, really refashioning the world in one's own image. That's a picture of the healthy person, of the strong person, the hardy individual, sometimes called in health psychology. And that version sees people as being born vulnerable and dependent and as having to become independent. And so maturation and development is really a gain and a process of becoming more and more autonomous and independent. That's really the goal. And that's mirrored by our form of social life that we begin in a nuclear family. And the modal picture in the US is you're 18 years old, you go away to school, and you only come back after that for Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas or whatever, and you go on about your life. We know that, of course, in most parts of the world, that's not how people have traditionally lived. People have lived in their family, extended family unit for their whole lives. And that is associated with a different way of understanding the person as primarily a nexus of relationships of interdependence. And that sort of more collectivist, sociocentric kind of self is more prevalent in the world. And leads to people talking and thinking about themselves somewhat differently. This distinction, which is present in anthropology, was taken up by cultural psychology and is really the mainstay of a huge amount of quantitative comparative research, partly because Harry Triandis and others developed measures for this. So comparing individualism and collectivism is a small cottage industry in cross-cultural psychology, and there are all these interesting differences you can show that play out in different ways. But there's some problems with this. First of all, these are very crude general categories, so we can see right away Edward Sampson's written a kind of critique of individualism, pointing out there are many kinds of individualism. And certainly many people labeled as collectivist would protest that actually there's a lot more going on than is captured by that description. For me, what's been interesting and striking about this is that while I can see those differences and see those differences in people that I work with in a clinical setting or that I visit and work with ethnographically, there are other ways of configuring the self. And so one way that's very obvious when you talk to Indigenous people, particularly those who are living in remote communities close to the land, is what could be called an ecocentric self. George Wenzel and Stairs wrote a paper years ago on this idea of an ecocentric self, and other people have pointed to it. And it's certainly something that came out in our work with the Inuit and Inuit concepts of mental health and illness. The notion that a person is a person by virtue of their constant transactions, not only with other people, so that's sort of the social, sociocentric or collectivist aspect of the self, but also by their transactions with the land and with the elements and with non-human beings. The animals in this ontology are non-human beings, and one is in dialogue with them as well. So that's a different way of configuring the self. And years ago, actually, as part of Jérôme, one of the participants in this network, introducing a network on medical anthropology and ethnopsychiatry, was the Haitian psychiatrist Carlo Sterlin. And Carlo talked about what he called a cosmocentric self. The idea that for Haitians and for many people, there is a vertical axis to existence. There are ancestors and there are spirits who are present and who are in some ways parallel to us, maybe in another dimension, or we could think of it as a vertical dimension. It's not quite precise, but the point is there's another domain there, and that then the self would be understood as in transaction with those constantly. And you do see this in how people narrate their experience. So if you ask me as a highly individualistic person about myself, I'm likely to tell you a few lines off my CV, that, my accomplishments or my, If you talk to someone who's more sociocentric, the first thing they might tell you is, oh, my father's so-and-so, my uncle is such and such. When I visited a marae in New Zealand, the way people introduced themselves was, I'm the person from this mountain and this river. I belong to this mountain and this river. So it's a different sense. And in Australia, the way that an Australian scholar, Kimberly Smith, put it was, we need to be needed by the land. So there's a filial relationship to the land. It's very different, as I say, than a city dweller who looks at land as a commodity or whatever would approach it. And finally, this cosmocentric view implies that there's an invisible world, there's a world of spirits, I'm in some relationship to that, I can be in a good relationship and I'll be healthy and they may talk to me or make things go better for me. Things can go wrong and I can suffer in relation to that. Anyway, the point of this is that, first of all, to explode the simple duality that we inherit from cultural psychology, and we could say we inherit it from colonialism, basically, because there's the Northern European standard, which is the ground zero, and then there's its opposite, which is Asia, let's say, or Africa. It depends what direction you move in. But usually the common version is East and West. That's, because you can. And there's a great irony about that. First of all, that it's asymmetrical, that the West in this case is Northern Europe and the East is, 2/3 of the population of the world. So it's not exactly symmetrical. But also that the East is being described from the point of view of the West. So it is a kind of projection. We feel, as de Tocqueville suggested, we're suffering from too much individualism. So we're very fascinated and attracted by communities that seem very collectivist and we caricature them, we simplify them. So for me, this approach has been helpful as a way of challenging some of the assumptions in mental health practice, which is very heavily written by individualistic approaches, and by calling for rethinking whether it's the notions of resilience, the notions of vulnerability, the notion that an attack on the land for an Indigenous person could be experienced as an attack on the self. It's not something that's immediately obvious to Western individualistic people, but it needs to be understood, and it has a lot of important implications, I think, down the line. So we've been promoting this in my own writing, and with students and so on. Lonzonzo Kapanake is a psychologist from Togo, who teaches at TELUC and UQAM, who wrote about the African concept of the person, invoking very much this, not only the sociocentric level, which is important, that is, people understand themselves very much as part of a clan, as part of a, this extended network, but also this vertical dimension that one is in dialogue with in relation to the ancestors. And the ancestors are mediators between, greater spirits and more impersonal spirits in some sense. So that's important, I think, for going beyond the idea of culture just as traits, and it's a certain way of talking about culture as an ontology, not in the radical way that ontology has been promoted by some in recent years, but in a more conventional, mundane way of just saying, look, an ontology is a notion of what the world consists of. If you think the world consists of spirits, and I don't, we have different ontologies, and that has consequences for how well we understand or don't understand each other. And if you give an explanation that's in terms of spirits, and I'm a biomedical practitioner who lives in a very individualistic, materialistic ontology, what do I do with that? Do I say, oh, that's fine, but I don't know what you're talking about? Do I translate it into something else? Do I have a pluralistic frame that says live and let live? So just to say, by laying this out, I'm saying that there's not only the ethnographic and sort of social philosophical question about what's going on here, what do people think, but there also are ethical and political questions about how do we coexist in the same physical space, more or less, when we have different ontologies. And I think this is, again, largely an unresolved question. It's a common question because you could say, well, a devout religious person has a different ontology from somebody who doesn't, because for them the Spirit of God might be very present, very accessible. And again, Tanya Lerman studies people who talk to God, and regularly. So those of us who don't talk to God and don't have an ontology that lets us take that literally have to do something else with that. Now, one way that we deal with that, I think, is by psychologizing it. So kind of what Jung did to up to a point, and what Martin Buber criticized him for doing, sort of psychologizing the spiritual. I think Jung didn't do it totally, because in the end he definitely had a more spiritual ontology hiding behind the psychologist, as it were. So it's an interesting question for me, and as I say, that in itself becomes an interesting topic for social science and anthropology, because it's talking about the nature of our contemporary pluralistic societies. We live in a province that is devoutly secular, I could say, to the point that it becomes a kind of religion itself, and poses challenges then for people who feel like, I don't see an echo of myself here. How does this coexist? So I think it's a very important topic going forward for social science, and for us very practically, for those of us who are working in policy spheres or health services spheres and so on, very important practical set of questions. And it connects to example I gave earlier around these how knowledge claims are being adjudicated. If an indigenous community says, this is our traditional healing practice, and we don't care what the evidence says about what the current best medical treatment is, this is what we want to do. Does our society, our larger society, say, fine, that's your right? Or does it say, that's a problem, we have to negotiate that somehow? As I say, I think these are really, this is the tough end of the spectrum. We all, many of us come to anthropology, come to social science, come to the whole issue of culture with an affection, a fascination with novelty, an affection for diversity, a concern for the underdog, for the silenced. But when we take it all the way down to really tough decisions where there are direct conflicts, I think we have unresolved questions that are, as I say, fundamentally ethical and political that we have to be thinking about.